Hi everyone. In this episode of The European Angle, I talk to Professor Mathias Hoffmann from the University of Zurich about Europe's economic and societal model and the challenges of balancing climate goals with industrial competitiveness. We also explored the fragmentation of Europe's internal market, Europe's responsibility in supporting emerging economies in the global south, and how geopolitical tensions such as US tariffs and militarization are shaping Europe's economic future. Europe has a good societal model, but its economic performance isn't as great. What makes Europe's societal model resilient, and could it be utilized to improve Europe's economic standing?
I think that's a good question. I think Europe invented the welfare state, and that has actually generated a fair amount of social cohesion. I mean, to be fair, this welfare state was born out of severe societal conflict, social conflict in the late 19th century, and it was expanded after two bloody world wars, right? So the social welfare state in the form we know it only in Europe and the world uh, originates from two bloody world wars, which I think is something also worth highlighting in the context of your channel, the European angle, right? I mean, Europe is unfortunately born out of bloody wars, and reason only set in response to the dire experiences that nations had made, people had made. That said, I mean, the social welfare state today probably needs update, right? I mean, this social system is probably in imbalance because, as you rightly say, I mean, there's a lack of growth. There's a lack of growth that has many sources, that has to do with the lack of dynamism in our economies, which may have to do with taxes that are being very distortive, that has to do also sometimes with the social welfare state itself, in the sense that in some countries, I'm thinking of my native Germany here, but also France and others, are not giving people enough of an incentive to work. And I mean, it's not because people are lazy. I mean, if you have a marginal tax rate, as we say that in economics, it is of an additional euro that you may earn in some income brackets, and you don't have to be very rich for that. You pay 70 cents in quasi taxes, that is taxes on social security contributions, then it's not a huge incentive to work more. Plus, of course, there's then the employer's contribution, which makes insurance, that makes things look very, very expensive. That's one aspect, but it's not the only one. Uh, um, there's, as I said, a lack of dynamism, which also has to do that, in spite of there being now a European single market, this market in many ways remains highly fragmented, right? And so um, we're now talking about these trade wars, and Trump slamming all kinds of tariffs on everybody, and the numbers are changing all the time. But if you look into Europe itself, I mean, the IMF did some quite interesting calculations that it thinks that even in what is the European Union with a single market, even within among those countries, the de facto restrictions on the free flow of services, on the free flow of goods, the free flow of banking services and capital amounts to tariff barriers that are easily equivalent to an average tariff rate of 120%. Imagine that, right? And that's after 20, 30 years of the single market in Europe. And so that's where the leverage is, right? I mean, that's where we have to tear down the internal barriers to, for example, allow startups to scale up to a truly European market, right? If you do that in the US, you have a service or something, you scale up to the US as a whole, you have a continental sized market with a homogeneous legislation. You try to do that in Europe as a startup in whatever area. You easily hit, besides language barriers, all kinds of barriers, right? Finance of firms, venture capital markets, banking markets are fragmented along national boundaries. There are special rules on employment in every country. There are different tax issues. It's difficult to register a firm in different countries. So all of these issues arise. And even though, of course, all of this has become a lot easier in the last 35 years since the Maastricht Treaty, we are far from done on this. And that's where the hard work is in European integration. I sometimes wished that the guys in Brussels were less keen on micro-regulating every little aspect of life, which actually frustrates a lot of people in Europe and is not necessarily conducive to an enthusiasm towards Europe. And instead focused on this nitty-gritty work of getting the framework right. You don't have to micro-regulate everything, but you can actually push through a couple of standards, and that is where it's often getting hard.
You mentioned the origin of the European welfare state in the two world wars. And what effect could the war in Ukraine have on the European welfare state?
I haven't thought about what it means for the welfare state. I mean, we've seen effects on the welfare state. Again, I mean, if I go back to my native Germany, I mean, here in Switzerland, we see a lot of the same discussions, but I'm sometimes referring to, say, Germany also because a lot of the issues that may afflict us here in Switzerland afflict, say, a bigger country that in geographical and a political sense is closer to the front lines, if you want. It is also, of course, a big player in terms of European integration to an extent that Switzerland is not. That you there see a lot of the things that may become relevant for us. If you think about, say, the 4 million people that fled Ukraine right after the war. There was an outburst of European solidarity. They went to Poland, a lot of them, that relative to the country's population absorbed the largest share. But say Germany was also in the front rows. And one big thing that most European countries did is that they immediately gave these people the right to work. They immediately put them on an equal footing to their own citizens in terms of the entitlement for social benefits and so forth. And while, of course, there are issues that I'll shortly talk about and frictions, on the grand scale, this has worked amazingly well. And that's a glimpse of a European welfare state that, of course, institutionally is not made for that type of influx with people who never paid contributions. And of course, it's expensive, and of course, it can't continue like that forever. But I mean, that stress test is actually a success. We often talk about the military success of, say, Europe getting now its act together in terms of course, everything is slow. This is European style, but is moving in the right direction in terms of building up its industrial base for weapons and arms industry, military base, is also providing Ukraine with a lot of arms, but in particular, and that's maybe more important, with the means to help itself by actually building its own arms industry itself, and which is now starting to export to the West. Think of the incidents we have just recently had with the drones in Poland and on the eastern border of NATO. And Zelensky coming out and say, look, I mean, you help us. I'm happy to help you with the special expertise we have in catching drones. This is becoming a two-way thing, right? And it's exciting to see that among all, of course, the backdrop of all this is terribly sad. It's a war of aggression by Russia, but it's encouraging to see how a new Europe is arising from. And the thing you mentioned in terms of the European welfare states is actually a particularly interesting aspect to that, because it means how a European social welfare system should work. If you have large shocks in one country, you would expect, as economists, and you're talking to an economist, right? I mean, it's like you would think that if countries, what we call, have asymmetric shocks, then there's mechanisms that help them deal with these asymmetric shocks. These involve all kinds of things. They may actually mean financial insurance. They may mean people migrating. It may mean a social welfare system cushioning the impact of this economic shock. It doesn't always have to be a war. Could be disaster. Could be a local recession, right? To deal with these. Now, we don't have these mechanisms to the extent we would need them. And of course, just dealing with a large influx of 4 million people into a welfare system to which these people never contributed is not a long-term solution. But it's amazingly how well it has worked with varying degrees. Let's talk about those. For example, Poland was much more successful in integrating these people into the labor market. Two things help there. First of all, Poland has a booming economy, has been the growth champion in Europe for the best part of the last 25 to 30 years. No matter who ruled, right? Whether it was Tusk, whether it was the PIS, the peace, it was a growth champion, and it was happy to absorb a lot of that labor. Second thing, of course, they're culturally close. The language is relatively close, so people easily integrated in the labor market. Third thing is that towards the foreigners, Poland's absorbed people and were willing to help. But I mean, overall, the welfare system is maybe not as generous as it is next door in Germany. So if you, for example, compare the Netherlands with Germany, which in terms of the structures, growth dynamics are maybe more directly comparable. Then you see that 70% of the Ukrainians who came to the Netherlands are in work by now. 30% still rely on social benefits. In Germany, it's the exact inverse. 30% are in work, 70% don't not. That may exactly have to do with the generosity and with the enforcement of sanctions in this social benefit system, the social insurance system, where there are clearly efficiency gains to be had. Not talking about who's entitled and so forth, but even efficiency gains to be had, for example, in the German system, right? Plus, of course, because the German system is more lenient, of course, people who cannot work are more likely to then go to, if they have a choice between where you go in Europe, you go to Germany, right? So there are issues. And I'm not saying any of those are lazy people or anything. And people react to incentives, right? I'm not here judging anything under a moral perspective. People rightfully react to the incentives where things suit them best, and they react to these incentives. And in designing a welfare state, you have to take that into account. It's the politicians and the government's problem if they don't design things in an incentive compatible way.
So before you mentioned that Europe is becoming more independent in military technology, And since we're currently living in a time of tension, the war in Ukraine, it is, it, I think it makes sense to invest in military technology, but what is made with these weapons once a peaceful period follows in the next couple of months or years? Doesn't more weapons also mean more aggression, especially coupled with rising nationalism in many European countries? And also, will these weapon factories close once a peaceful period follows? And what are the consequences of these layoffs? Does this make people more radical if they lose their jobs?
This is a good question. I mean, where do we want to go with this? I think have to zoom back in history a little bit. So I remember I'm 53 years old. So I was 18 when the wall fell. And those 1980s, to which nobody wants really to go back to, were in the period of big peace, right? I mean, towards the end, and in hindsight, with Gorbachev arriving and reforming Russia and the East Bloc collapsing, it all seems like a benign period, but it wasn't, right? I mean, 10 years before, the West, the NATO actually had doubled down on nuclear armament. That's the double act. For example, brought down Schmidt in Germany to actually the decision to station Pershing II missiles on German soil, which were actually directly targeting Russia, right? And that was politically highly contested in Germany, and it was a period of high conflict. Then came, say, a certain ease in tensions with Reagan and Gorbachev starting to negotiate in Reykjavik, the famous summit. And from there was this trust building. And eventually we know that, however, also that this doubling down by NATO on what were very, very expensive investments actually was a contributing factor to the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. What I'm saying here is the following. I mean, we have been living in extraordinary benign times for the last 30 years, 35 years. I mean, until 2020, I would say, right? And then came COVID, severe tensions in our democracies, and then, of course, the attack of Russia on Ukraine in 2022, which completely changed the global outlook, or at least the European outlook. That is important to see. Why? Because over these 30 years, Europe has been eating up its peace dividend. It has reduced expenditure on military expenditure, say, by almost 90%, right? And while it was probably right to reduce the arsenals of the Cold War, it just went too far. In particular, it was asymmetric, right? Because the US never did the same reduction. And everybody was relying on the US to, in case of doubt, help out with these things. And that changed with Trump. That is the new world we live in. So the question is, what is the right level? And you rightly asked. I think it's less about levels of and stocks of arms. And I'm also not the right person to answer that, right? What is the right level of military expenditure in terms of how many tanks we should have and how many drones and so forth? I can't answer that. But it's about capabilities, right? It's about maintaining a scientific military industrial complex. That is a word that's often used on the political left to delineate what this is about. But let's use that word because it captures the whole thing quite well. And with an external threat, it's not as dire as it may sound. It's what we need, right? You need the scientific, technological capabilities to defend yourself. That doesn't mean that every country in Europe needs to have all those capabilities. That's exactly why we have NATO, why we have European Union, so that can actually have a division of labor and tasks. And that's also, I think, something that is super important, because when you say, well, we have the rise of authoritarianism in some parts of Europe as well, that is true. But of course, the whole design of Europe is also to make war impossible. And if we now move to more cooperation in terms of military technology, of military expenditure, and there is a division of labor, it's also clear that none, and the aim is that none of the countries in Europe actually could ever go to war against the others, because it intricately depends on the others. That's where Europe started, right? When the French and Schuman and so forth in the 1950s talked about the European community for coal and steel. Why do you think they chose those industries? Well, they were important at the time, much more important than they are nowadays, but they are also the industries that you need to build an army. Putting that under a European umbrella with quotas, with certain rules and so forth, knowing what the other one is doing, having mergers that were cross-border in an embattled and shrinking industry, was all important to build trust, because you knew the Germans would not be able to build the next Dickeberta or whatever, right? That's what this is about, while at the same time, at least across Europe, preserving and actually building in many areas, rebuilding the capabilities that a modern, say, claim to self-defense needs. It's less about stocks. It's about this. That then implies that you need a certain demand, right? Because big problem, that's something we saw with the start of the war in Ukraine, is, yeah, we were able to build the tanks or certain air defense systems or whatever, but 3 a year or 10 a year, right? There was manufacturing production, which had to do a lot with the arsenals having been shrunk since the 1980s. And there was no demand from governments. So you effectively had to ask the producers of these arms to actually go out and start from scratch with small lots. And that's always a problem, right? You want to scale. That's also why you want Europe, right? You want scale, and then you want standardization. Don't want 5 different tanks across Europe. Maybe you want 1 or 2 and things like that, right? Maybe you want 1 or 2 or 3 fighter jets across Europe. Not everybody needs to be participating in building it, right? But everybody wants to have a part of the share. Some guys do drones, others do nuclear submarines, others do tanks, and so forth. That's, I think, where we need to be heading. And that's hopefully the way we are going. There's another aspect to this, which I think is quite encouraging. We also shouldn't think a lot in these big investments in high profile, prestige, military projects. Think of fighter jets. I'm not the person to judge whether, for example, a European stealth fighter coming to the market and coming to service in 2040 plus X is meaningful militarily from a defense perspective. But what I see as an economist interested in these matters is that we have now much, much more of a startup culture in the defense industry, right? There are all these small startups using AI. The hottest German startup right now is Helsing, right? And building drones. And it's building drones and scaling up with plants all across Europe, including Ukraine. So they're testing their drones on the go as they're being produced together with the Ukrainians. That's a European production network. And there are many others of these startups. And that is quite exciting because it generates, say, a technological and scientific and economic ecosystem that is intertwined with the military that can create a lot of jobs, is a big impetus for research, maintains and expands capabilities, and that's something we want, right? A lot of technologies we have seen being adopted as civilian technologies, be it the internet, be it jet travel, over the last 50, 70 years have military origins, right? The chip industry, as we know it nowadays, yes, was really started from some garage or computer industry. Apple, Steve Wozniak's and Steve Jobs' famous garage, or Hewlett Packard's. True, but a lot of the impetus for the development of this electronics and of big computers came from military purposes, right? Simulation of nuclear detonations and things like that. So yes, there is also a reason to maintain these things, and there will be spillovers. A lot of these things will have civilian uses. Drones are an example, right? A lot of them have also civilian uses, and I think that's what we need to come to. And then, of course, once you have civilian uses, your question obviates itself, right? Because then it's not about when the external threat diminishes, will that industry die? Probably not, right? I mean, America is a good example, right? I mean, I'm not saying we need a European army of American size and strength. And you could argue America is overspending on these things because it doesn't have that welfare state. And if it was to finance both a welfare state and an army that size, it would be even more bankrupt than it already seems. But there's a middle ground, right? Where you don't want to do the mistake we did in 1990, that we were saying, okay, now this is the end of history, to paraphrase Francis Fukuyama's. Now we don't need a military anymore. No, that was wrong. And we need to keep the capabilities.
You mentioned that the manufacturing capability is pretty low and that not a lot of weapons can be produced in a year. Is this the case for other economic or technological sectors too? Because I feel like we are neither a digital economy nor an industrial one, but more of a deindustrialized economy with not a lot of manufacturing capabilities and not a lot of manufacturing happening here, but more in Asia.
Yes, that's an important question. I mean, now from an economist's point of view, what we see historically is that as economies grow, display, if you to take a 150 years perspective, they display a quite distinctive sectoral transition, right? So they start usually as agrarian societies, then they move to an industrial society, and then comes the famous service society. So you move from an emphasis on the first, the secondary, and to the tertiary sector. And that's pretty robust as a pattern of growth for an economy over the long run. You see the same patterns emulated at higher speed in countries like China or India, right? That Europe and the US maybe have had 150 years. China did that in effectively 40 or 50, right? The China of 1980 was largely an agrarian economy. The learning from that is you would expect that as an economy gets richer and more mature, this manufacturing share shrinks. That has largely to do with the huge productivity gains that you have in manufacturing, right? Automation actually means that you can produce more with fewer workers, that you then free for other things and things that you can't easily automate. And that's why we're nowadays all in services of some kind, right? Look at me. I'm thinking of myself as a service provider, if with paid by the public. something that is not yet as easily automated. Maybe in 10 years' time, would be some AI teaching you, right, at university. For now, that's harder to automate than the production of a computer. And that's something to bear in mind, right, as a general trend, because everybody who then goes around and says, oh, I bring manufacturing back. Yep. So you try it through subsidies, you try it through tariffs. There are different ways of doing it. In Europe, we try to do it through subsidies. Biden tried to do it through subsidies. Trump tries to do it through tariffs. Neither approach, I think, will be super successful. It may actually work sometimes in bringing certain production back home, but it doesn't necessarily create the number of jobs you expect, exactly because manufacturing has become so incredibly productive, and the manufacturing workers of nowadays are no longer the manufacturing workers of the 1950s in their blue suits, their blue collar, say working suits, but they're rather, guys in hoodies and chinos, and basically programming things up and vigilating machines, right? There's more software in anything manufacturing than there used to be, and so forth, right? So that's something to bear in mind, and that's clearly an irreversible trend. That said, of course, we live in this very, very, say, conflict-ridden, tension-ridden period. We're talking about geopolitics again, a term that for many, many years you only heard among some French political scientists, which is gone global again. There, of course, the question is again, don't we want to be able to do certain things on our own, and don't we want to be autark, and so forth? If you look at how complex many production chains are, then it's quite obvious that it's futile to believe that you become completely autark in high tech, and that's true for the most advanced nations. I think if you want to take geopolitical lessons for industrial development, then there are two of them. The first thing is diversify your inputs, diversify your destination markets to where you sell, grow your internal market. That also makes you attractive, say, for example, for Chinese or whoever who want to build car factories in Europe. Then on the margin, you can do a bit of industrial policy, but don't expect politicians to have the wisdom to know what the next big thing is. Industrial policy often ends in disaster, with the wrong products being oversupplied at the wrong time. And there are many examples in history of that. And if we nowadays think about China eating global manufacturing, which to a large extent is done, then that's not, to my mind as an economist, not only a sign of strength either. It's often driven by a desire to be autarkic and to develop a stranglehold on the supply chains of others, which in many cases China has succeeded to do, but at a high economic and political cost. The political cost, to some extent, is the backslash called Trump and the backslash against globalization, but also economically, right? Because it's a highly imbalanced economy where you have almost socialist style. It's a socialist country, right? Where you say, okay, now that is the next big thing, and you invest there in electric cars, and in this artificial intelligence. All true. And of course, the Chinese are getting a lead with that. And yes, you can actually kickstart things very much as you can kickstart things through military expenditure, as I've mentioned earlier, like having an ecosystem. But if you then subsidize overproduction by all means, that eats into the consumption possibilities of your own people. That actually leads to a huge misallocation of resources and sooner or later to a big bust. And that's what we have seen time and again in China, right? We have seen the housing bust. We have seen the steel bust. We're now seeing already the electric vehicle bust in China. And you could go on, right? This is always the government thinking it knows where things need to go. I mean, I'm making it a little more simple than it is because the Chinese, of course, understand the power of markets to some extent, in the sense that they then let firms in these sectors compete against each other, etc., etc. But ultimately, it's a state-guided, if not state-run economy. And in the long run, this is hurting China more than it's benefiting. And a lot of this is driven by a desire to become autark, to become independent of the rest of the world, to be able to win a war against Taiwan and even the US and so forth. And the Chinese people is paying for that big time, right? In terms of huge misallocation of resources, low consumption growth. The government doesn't know best. That's a big picture of. To look into one of the reasons why economic historian thinks Europe was the part of the world that got rich first, with the Industrial Revolution and earlier roots, Renaissance, and all of this, the scientific revolution that came with this, leading to the Industrial Revolution, the bourgeois revolution, as some have called it, and why all that happened in Europe. One aspect that you see economic historians mention time and again is Europe with its little dukedoms, princedoms, many kingdoms, and so forth, many of which were at war with each other most of the time. So that wasn't nice, but it created an environment of constant competition. And if you were an inventor or a banker, you were Medici or Fugger, or you were Galileo Galilei, or you were Spinoza, and so forth. In that Europe, if your local prince wanted to throw you in jail, you could escape. You could run somewhere else. There was a constant competition between ideas while being spatially so close that things could spill over. Think of the Reformation. Think of a lot of things. It's not only industrial economics, it's the history of thought, right? That's the strength of Europe. So there is even a certain strength in a certain fragmentation. That's actually one of the reasons why actually economic historians often come to the conclusion China, which technologically in the year 1200 was miles ahead of Europe, was not the place where the Industrial Revolution started, because it was a big centralized kingdom where the center told you what you were allowed to think and do and develop. The competition wasn't there. And so they didn't use gunpowder to fire guns, but just for fireworks, which is nice. But the good and the bad that came out of this in Europe, out of this international competition, which often also ended in devastating wars, as both sides created also an environment of, as I said, of competition that laid the foundations for later growth. That's the strength of Europe. I just hope that going forward we'll be able to do that without the wars.
Before you mentioned that military startups are getting traction in, for example, in Germany. And is it also the case that there are more startups in other fields than military technology? And what could be done to attract even more startups, or to avoid that startup founders go to the US or Silicon Valley?
That's a very good question. I mean, it is hard to replicate such ecosystems from scratch, right? I mean, if you think of Silicon Valley, there's also sheer coincidence. why that happened. There's no deep economic reason that you could come up with as economic geographer. There were these two big universities, Stanford, Berkeley, which were heavily involved in military research in the post-war period, which started to develop these things. And then some of those guys, like the guys from Hewlett Packard and so forth, were just from the neighborhood and they started it there, right? So, and then you get agglomeration forces, and suddenly it's the valley. So it's hard to replicate. That said, again, scale matters, right? If you actually can sell your first Apple computer to the whole of the US, that helps. If you can tap finance from New York, because the venture capital scene in the 1970s wasn't quite yet the same as it was today, then that helps. And I think that's where the lessons for Europe are. I wouldn't be too pessimistic. You see a lot of startups. You see, look around here in Greater Zurich, right? That's a startup hub for Switzerland, of quite beyond the borders of Switzerland. You have places like Munich, you have places like Berlin, which are startup hubs in Germany. Paris is a startup city. Sweden, I think, per head of population has the highest number of unicorns of any country. Unicorns are startups being valued at more than 1 billion. And in the UK is the same, right, with London. What the problem is that we have, these are, as you see, it's very fragmented along national lines, because the venture capital scene is also often fragmented. It's internationalizing quickly, but that's a deeper problem. Not every firm is a startup that does something super fashionable, right? Some startups do simple things, or are medium-sized firms that could just be bigger, that are, say, machine tool producer, could, produce more if they had easier go in exporting and actually rolling out their products somewhere else. That's where I think tearing down these internal barriers matters, in particular in finance. And that's really my area of research over the last 15 to 20 years. We have started with these things, like in Europe, creating a banking union, right? Why? Because banking markets are still very much segmented along national lines, right? Try as a German, doesn't have to be something fashionable that you could call startup, as a German medium-sized firm located in Lörrach to get a loan from a French bank in Mulhouse, or the other way around, right? So you're tied to your local banks, and within Germany, even you have 400 local banks and Sparkassen, which often dominate the local markets because the branch of Deutsche or Commerzbank is in the next bigger cities in Stuttgart or somewhere, right? And they don't know you, so why should they talk to you? You're so small. That's where we see a lot of fragmentation. And that's something that we need to overcome, where we have moved in that direction over the last 50 to 20 years. I'm sure could probably do an independent podcast about the banking union, so I don't want to get into details about that. A lot of that has to do with the national fragmentation of banking regulation. It has also to do with the incentives that local banks or national banks have in investing into the government debt of their own country, because they're regulated by that country. The political interest that politicians have in preserving their own banking champions and so forth. Look at what's currently happening, right? We have been talking about European banking consolidation for 15, 20 years. The same politicians who go out, hold Sunday speeches about, or give Sunday speeches about the integrated European banking markets, are the very same politicians who are blocking, for example, the merger between Commerzbank and UniCredito, which would be the first SME that is lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, as they're abbreviated, focused cross-border bank in Europe. We don't have something like that. We have kind of retail banking crossing national borders nowadays, right? But where the real meat is in lending to risky projects by entrepreneurs. Banks doing that in a cross-border way. We don't have that yet, right? That's a long way to go. And the same is, of course, true for the ventures capital scene, because the legal framework for the tax treatment of such ventures and so forth is different in every country. So there are a million issues, and that's stuff we need to work on to actually not homogenize everything to the last letter. That's also not the case in the US, by the way. There are also 50 states, but the broad framework is the same, right? And the principles governing the federal law governing things is the same. That allows you to scale up and to address a nationwide market with 350 million consumers. And if you could lever that, and you would know, oh, I'm a European startup and I can lever up. I have the same laws everywhere. I have the same access to finance everywhere. And I'm maybe sitting in Berlin, but I can get this finance from London. I can get it from Paris. I can get it from a Parisian French bank. I can get it from an Austrian bank. I can get it from a Swiss bank. That's what counts. That's something we can emulate. Replicating individual ecosystems is hard, but then they happen, right? And I think we have these ecosystems en miniature already. Leveraging that more by creating a big internal market.
So would it be necessary for Europe to move closer together? For example, making the EU more a confederation rather, more a federal state? And what influence would that have if the EU moved closer together? It would be more central, especially also on politics.
That's a big vision, and I think it's the vision that some of the founders of Europe were on the one hand side projecting, on the other hand fearing, right? I mean, let's not forget, a lot of the impetus to Europe as we know it today came from the French as a gesture of reconciliation towards the Germans who took the hand under Adenauer. But it was also, as I said, a way of tying in the Germans into the framework of responsibilities and making sure they wouldn't go it alone again, right, against the rest of Europe. That's something to bear in mind, because when I hear this talk about a federal state, it always depends on who is saying it. And I often read behind the scene, it's a federal state with French characteristics or whatever, right? Eastern Europeans are much less enthusiastic about that idea because they cherish their freshly won freedoms post 1990 too much. In particular, a country like Poland, right? That as a cultural nation has existed since the Middle Ages, has existed as a genuine state, however, was eradicated from the map in 1792 after 3 partitions, and only resurrected as a state in 1918 or 19, just to be erased from the map again by criminal attacks by the Germans and by the Russians in 1939, and then living under the say subjugation of Stalinist Russia for the next 50 years. Those guys are super reluctant, understandably, to just become a canton or a federal state in a united Europe. So I don't see this happen. That said, it's quite clear there are certain things that if Europe wants to play a role in this future world, where each of the member states is just too small, even the biggest ones. There needs to be a certain unification, and it's about the usual discussions you always have when a loose federation becomes a federal state. You don't necessarily have to go all the way anytime soon, but learning the lessons from the toothing troubles of federations as we know them is instructive in that respect. Start with the US. I know Switzerland is historically older, 1291, but say the one that instructs us about these things, the date to my mind is 1848, rather than 1291. And so let's take the US as the older guys, right? I mean, a lot of this came from the need to defend themselves against the British. Then you had this fledgling federation, which had to win another war in 1812 against the British again. And that was all about, how do we create a common fiscal capacity to do one thing? An army, and in particular a navy, right? And a navy where everybody enjoys the benefits of, being independent of the Brits. But of course, when you build a big navy, the coastal states benefit from the military. Whereas if you're in the hinterland, you're not benefiting much. Big, tricky questions. How do you go about these things, right? And a lot of, say, the origins of the fiscal union of the US actually goes back to that period. Interesting enough, it wasn't really a monetary union for another 140 years, right? Or 110 years until 1913, when they finally created the Federal Reserves. And so Europe is in many ways a monetary union without a fiscal union. The US went the other way around. In between, by the way, in America was many banking crises, many local fiscal crises, a civil war. And so the upshot is Rome wasn't built in one day. And what is done by the center and what is done by the individual states, the federal states, is always up to negotiations and often over decades and centuries. And it's actually dictated by circumstances, right? There's nothing that focuses minds more than an external threat. That was true for Switzerland in 1291 already. And it was true for the Americans in the 1770s, and it was true again in 1812. And it's currently true, I think, for Europe. It's not necessarily out of choice, but actually out of need that you realize, there are certain things we need to do together. And let's focus on those. Right? The EU doesn't have to micromanage supply chain laws. The EU doesn't have to regulate the speed limit on European roads. The EU, to my mind, doesn't have to regulate whether we should drive cars with internal combustion engines or electrical engines. It can set frameworks. It can, provide a common budgetary framework and a rule set for how military procurement works. It can actually set a price for carbon. It can try to actually run hard enough a reasonably single-voiced foreign policy. It's doing it already relatively successfully in international trade. And no single country does its own negotiations. True, they all try to influence the negotiations in their own way. But at least the formal prerogative of negotiating trade matters has been delegated entirely to the center. And that's the way it should be in what is a single market. Right? So we have to discuss these single policy fields, and they give the EU a lot of power. But at the same time, keep it out of a lot of the aspects of people's everyday lives. And what we currently see, it's exactly the opposite. And that creates a lot of frustration.
So you mentioned that now with the war in Ukraine, Europe has to move closer together. But I feel like that nationalist movements are getting more prominent, especially in Eastern Europe. And why doesn't this external threat, in this case Russia, have a more uniting effect on Europe? And can the nationalist movements in Eastern Europe be explained with the fact that they haven't been independent for long?
Yes, I think that's one of the aspects I mentioned earlier. They haven't been independent for long, or let me put it like this: the independence is very, very hard won, right? And you don't give it easily away. And I don't think it explains the rise of authoritarianism per se. I don't think there's a difference with, I mean, for example, in Poland, the Kaczynski bloc, PiS and Tusk couldn't be more different in their outlook on Europe on the one hand side. But I would be surprised, I don't know, but I would be surprised if Tusk was truly a federalist in the sense of, having a United States of Europe. I don't think any Pole would have that. And yes, you could argue the same for Hungary. You could argue the same for the Slovak Republic. You could argue the same for the Czech Republic, which is always oscillating in and out of that camp, depending on who wins the elections. But then look to the Baltic states, which are all impeccably democratically governed, no authoritarian tendencies there. They have the same notion on this. So it's not only that, right? I think, of course, it has to do with immaturity of democracies. And that's each nation there carries a baggage of history with itself that frames perceptions, and it's hard to predict, which will slide into a more authoritarian view and of the world, and maybe an authoritarian system, and who won't. What I have to say about this is the following: it's hard to rule out these tendencies once and for all. But the way to think about this, I think, of course, you could think about Europe having more ways of sanctioning departures from the rule of law and so forth. And it's trying to sharpen its teeth on these things, and has done what it can with some success, say in the Polish and the Hungarian case, by blocking funds and so forth, on which these guys always rely. All of that is true. But then I'm an optimist. You could turn it positive way around. The EU is not necessarily about, being able to completely avoid these, how should I say, this drift into a more authoritarian system, but it mitigates them. So it's hard to prove the fact, but imagine a counterfactual world where Central Eastern Europe was not part of the EU. How would Hungary look like then under Orban? Or how would the PIS actually have changed Poland if it was not constrained by European money, by European rules, by a need to be able to export across open borders? That is the question we should be asking. That's again going back to this old European, why was Europe the place where the Industrial Revolution happened? Because we're all relatively close together. Borders in the Middle Ages and the early modern Europe were open. You could just up your sticks and go. Well, what is modern Europe about? About the mobility of labor to go where you find a job and want to live. That's your right in the European Union for your generation. And I'm the first one of the first generation to have fully benefited from that, right? Schengen is a early 90s thing, and I was starting my studies then I moved around Europe. And your generation, for them, it's natural. That's why this is so important. It's a check on dictators, right? If you are a gifted Hungarian or Pole and you don't like your government, unlike a Russian or a Chinese or whatever, you just go to France or go to Germany or go to Switzerland. And that's a big check. It doesn't mean that Orban is going to go away easily, but I'm pretty sure it reduces his half-life quite considerably. It's the other role model. Look into German unification. I've seen that myself, right? Because as a young adult, or say when I was your age, how the East Germans were watching West German TV. They saw not everything was beautiful over there. I think most didn't have just delusions about these things, but they saw the material advantages of that system. They saw the relative freedom of that system with all the downsides. And that's why they rebelled. It was the role model across the wall, so close, that made this system implode. Yeah? Because they were bankrupt, sure, but they wouldn't have acknowledged they are bankrupt if it hadn't been in direct comparison to some system that worked a lot better. Right? And that's why these people started to flee and suddenly showed up in the West German embassies in Prague and in Budapest. And that collapsed the system. And that's Europe. There's always, and that's why I also think that the European superstate is not something we should strive for. You want this competition. And as a Swiss, you understand that almost genetically, right? But a lot of your, not Swiss Europeans don't fully understand this aspect, to my mind. A homogeneous state where everything is the same from Lisbon to Helsinki also eliminates diversity and competition and the competition for the best solution in all aspects of life. And that's also, this competition for the best solution is what autocrats hate. That's what they're really allergic against. That's why I'm actually more hopeful. That doesn't avoid the Wilders. That doesn't avoid Wilders. It's harmless against Orban, even though he's xenophobic and everything. But so far, he's played to all democratic roots. Very different from Orban. Very different from the peace, right? But that's where I think the big advantage of Europe is. Keeping those borders open, the flow of ideas, the flow of goods, the flow of services, and the people then eventually react to the incentives. Brings us back to our start of our discussion.
Do you think overregulation can contribute to Euroscepticism?
Yes. I mean, I think that's become obviously clear. I think that's exactly why getting this balance between the center and the individual member states is so important. And you become paternalistic about every aspect of people's life, then you harvest frustration and Euroscepticism. Absolutely. I think what people care about Europe is guaranteeing them a freedom to travel, a single money to move. That's also something they experience, right? That often students already experience early on. I think Erasmus and these programs are great because they create new Europeans. You start to appreciate what a luxury it is to be able to move across countries and cultures without even having a passport or an ID card, and to be able to study somewhere and to get the points you get somewhere else recognized at your home university and so forth. It's just wonderful, and that's a big thing. The same is, of course, true for goods and for services. The same must be to protect these people, that is to protect our external borders against illegal migration. We have to select who is coming. That doesn't mean we have to become heartless, but we have to select who is coming and make, while at the same time opening a legal channel into Europe, defense and trade, right? These are the things people want. That's what Europe should look into. Make our external borders secure, focus on defense, which so far wasn't their remit, probably aligned with NATO, not against it, focus on international trade and demolish internal barriers to the free flow of capital, labor, and long run homogenize social security systems. Homogenize, not a big single one. That won't work with our large fiscal disparities anytime soon. That may entail a modicum of European taxation as well. But it also means that Europe gives back certain powers. If you just try to micromanage, supply chains, people will hate it. And they do, right?
Do you think Europeans aren't as confident into the future than people from other continents? And are Europeans also more conservative about novel ideas?
Historically, they haven't been, right? That's what made Europe big from the 15th century onwards. I don't think they're generically more conservative, right? If we look, for example, we're talking about the social model or the societal model in more generally, right? It's not only about social insurance and benefits, it's also about the right to live in the way you like. Europe is, on average, huge variation, right? Eastern Poland is different from Central Berlin, for sure. But by and large, much more socially liberal than vast parts of the US and many other countries. So that's where conservatism doesn't fly. Yes, people they have a lot to lose. That's what I think, right? So that's what makes them conservative. And if you don't offer a vision where you are going and say, okay, this is what I take from you. You still have that and that and that. I'm not giving you, say, a guaranteed income, but I can tell you the government will be there if things go bad for you. But we encourage you to take risk. If you lose your jobs, we help you. If these basic promises are kept and delivered on, you do basic things right and well, rather than over-promising and then failing on a large scale. That makes people insecure and conservative. I'm not sure they're so conservative. They just don't trust their political representatives to deliver on these things. And that's what needs to change. It's more, in political science, people call it, I'm not a political scientist, but they call it input and output legitimacy, right? There are two ways that a system can deliver legitimacy. Either by, the way it gets selected, so having good democratic grounding and rules that are kept, but also by delivering the right outcomes, justice, reasonable, fairness, access to education, etc., certain equity in terms of chances, efficient outcomes, and so forth. If both or one of the things fails, then the other is always in jeopardy, right? China is, if you want, for many years has been a system. That's why the Chinese Communist Party is so nervous about its lack of growth, right? About youth unemployment among graduates, university graduates of 20% and more. Because it's a system that's entirely built on output legitimacy. It's a dictatorship, effectively. But however, always thrived on the promise, we'll make your life better. You stay out of politics. We'll look into that for you. But your life will become better and your kids will have it better than you, so forth. And now this promise starts to get broken. The issue of legitimacy on the input side becomes more acute. Europe historically has had this input legitimacy as a democratic rule, but has been very bad on delivering on the outcomes. So that explains why the input legitimacy is starting to be called into question, right? Is the democratic system the right thing? Isn't Chinese the better one? So there needs to be a balance, right? So you cannot actually just not deliver on growth, just not deliver on equity. People feel threatened, and then you have illegal immigration and have people stabbing each other. I'm not saying these are mass phenomenon and that we need to get crazy and to listen to the xenophobes, but people perceive these things and you have to deal with them. And if you just put them aside and say they don't exist, you mustn't think about this, then you're making the right-wing extremists strong. You have to deal with the problems. You have to be competent. You can do that in the framework of a democratic and fair system, but you have to deliver on it. And there are countries that have done it, like Denmark and others, which have been relatively successful. Funnily enough, right? If you think about the rise of European populism, it's not Central Eastern Europe. It's Scandinavia starting in the 1990s. And that is effectively right. I mean, you had large-scale immigration in these countries, partly because they were often very open for, in a well-meaning way, Sweden, or because they had large-scale immigration because of the oil fields, Norway, or Denmark and others. Not the oil fields there, but they're still quite open. Then what do you expect is going to happen? I mean, Milton Friedman, the famous economist, said once, I mean, you cannot have open borders and a social welfare state at the same time. That was the origin of the rise of the True Finns, the Swede Democrats, and so forth, right? Which drove that system in front of them. Now, within a democratic setting, those Scandinavian countries have reacted. The Social Democrats in Denmark being maybe the most prominent example, moving very far to the right on immigration. Not everything is great. I'm not saying that. But they have managed to get their people behind them without the threat to democracy that we see in some other parts of Europe, including France, including Germany, and so forth, coming from the right. And you have to accommodate these points and do something about it and not just say it doesn't exist as a problem. Then do something about it within a fair and democratic framework. And that doesn't mean you have to become a xenophobe in so doing. You can still be, open to the world and welcoming to those who really need your help. And so that's a good example, right? Because that's where right-wing parties really started. It wasn't necessarily Hungary. It wasn't necessarily Poland. And that's what Europe needs to work on. That brings us back to the very beginning of our discussion, right? About having this societal model rebalanced. If I read the newspaper as a German student, and so, well, I mean, pension funding is, still working, but we're increasing pensions for this year for pensioners by 4% to 1% above inflation, as has happened over the last couple of years, each year. While everybody knows full well the system is completely unsustainable given the demographics, what are you making out of this? This is shattering the trust in this system, right? And if at the same time, as a medium income earner, you have 70% quasi-taxes on the marginal euro you earn, you become disenfranchised. That needs to be rebalanced. People need to be able to see, okay, I'm contributing a fair share, but this is not, affecting my livelihood. I still have a nice income. But if things go wrong in my life, I can rely on this. This promise is kept because the system is well funded. And there is no obvious leakage in the system and complete unfairness and so forth perceived or real. And that's where we have to work. And that's, also entails unpopular reform because not everybody will be a winner. Yeah. Older generations have a lot to lose because they're doing too well in relative terms. Right. So, and Switzerland is not entirely exempt from that. I remember when, and there was the vote on the 14th installment on the public pension in Switzerland, the 14. AHV-Rente. I had a big lecture the next morning with 700 students, first year macro. I said, well, so this is the old against the young. I mean, you have to ask your grandma to invite you. More often, your funding, it's at your expense. And, with our demographics, the old ones being the majority and the ones to go to vote, that's an issue, and that needs not a fight among generations, but that needs political leadership and also properly political action on the side of the young, right? To say, okay, we don't want to make our granny starve. That's not the point, but we need a rebalancing of this, right? Because otherwise people resignate or they leave the country or whatever. And that's not what we want.
You mentioned the origin of populism in Scandinavia caused by open borders. And now I've heard a lot that the refugee crisis in Europe that was about 10 years ago had kind of an influence on populism or far-right parties getting more traction. And is that really the case?
In Germany, it's quite clear that the AfD, which was founded as a moderately right-wing Eurosceptic party of conservative economics professors, many of them already retired, but well within the democratic arc, they were fighting against the bailouts for Greece and so forth, starting in 2012. And they were already on their way out again. People didn't pay attention to them anymore, and they were, after initial successes in votes and opinion polls, were already tapering out. Then came 2015, and that kickstarted it, and that's also when the AfD eventually got taken over by right-wing extremists. And so it's quite clear that spurned this rise. It's always interesting that the areas that maybe have the lowest share of foreign population or foreign-born population, say Eastern Germany, for obvious reasons, because they never had any migrant workers in those 40 years that it was the GDR, always seem the most xenophobic. So I'm not aware of research on Germany that looks into granular data from this for Germany. But what we know for the Brexit vote, which was a similar populist vote, driven also by allegedly immigration, there's clear evidence that exactly this pattern holds. That is actually not the areas that have a particularly high share of foreign-born population that were pro-Brexit, but actually the ones with relatively low share. But what mattered was the gradient of population in the years before Brexit, or the Brexit vote. So you may have started from a very, very low level in some part of Northern England in terms of foreigners, but then you had a large influx in a short time. where local schools were overburdened, where social services were overburdened, where these people couldn't be absorbed into the labor market quickly enough, where therefore you had rising crime. Of course, that's what matters. So if you overburden the system in too short a time and absorb too many people in too short a time, also making it difficult for themselves to assimilate, right? Because if you're suddenly in a class with students that are 30% from abroad, how do you learn the local language, right? There's an issue there where the whole thing of the host society integrating these people in any meaningful way doesn't work anymore. So you actually have to manage these things, and I expect similar things have happened to some people in Eastern Germany. It's also true that, of course, if you are relatively uneducated and so forth, you're in more direct competition to these people once they're allowed into the labor market, because they don't have any formal qualifications, or at least not formal qualifications that are right away recognized here in Europe. So they compete for relatively low-skilled jobs with those who feel themselves maybe precarious. And I'm not condoning of these feelings, right? But I can understand that and I can rationalize them. That's something that politicians have to be aware of when they do these things. And if you then have the sense that we're losing control because people are flooding through Europe, that was the perception people had at the time and still have to some extent. So if they have the sense they're in control, they're much more welcoming to let people in, right? If they say, okay, you can also ask for asylum, but we decide on who stays and who comes and so and we don't want this to be put together. We don't want people smugglers in North Africa to decide who is coming to our countries, actually taking an adverse selection of the relatively rich in their home countries, because you have to be able to pay these guys. We want those who are really needy. And then those who come for work are not politically persecuted. We want to select those according to certain criteria. That's, I think, where what has to move, and that's a task for Europe, right? Because that has to do with this external border. Because unless you solve this internal freedom of movement that we discussed earlier, that is also decisive, will crumble, and that's one of the most important aspects of Europe.
Yeah. So maybe one last question. You mentioned before that Europe became so powerful because it allowed competition to happen. And now we've been talking about how Europe can become even better and even more dominant and powerful. But isn't it the right time for Europe maybe to step back and let other people, for example, in the global south, emerge and develop themselves economically? Because especially with colonialism, we had such a negative impact on these countries. And wouldn't it be good to not just focus on our development, but also on the development of less well-off countries?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, I don't want to deny the crimes that colonialism constituted to in many ways. But it's a very, very nuanced picture, right? There were crimes, but in the better cases, there was also an institutional heritage, right? If you think about, say, how the world's largest democracy, India, as a nation state in that form, wouldn't be thinkable without the colonial heritage, for good and for bad, right? But an entity of hundreds of princedoms, some Muslim, some Hindu, whatever, never developed a notion of India as a state, right? But it was the colonial heritage, which of course was also characterized by violence, but also the Raj, right? The administrative, the legal system that actually is the basis for modern India. That's I think a good example. The colonial offsprings that shed off the repression of their colonizers in the Anglosphere, right? I mean, the US started as a colony, then became a colonial power itself with all that. So I think it's a nuanced way. So when you look into, say, for example, what determines growth of former colonies, then yes, colonial exploitation is clearly a bad thing, but there were colonizers who were relatively better than others in leaving their countries, in their colonies also an institutional heritage. Some were more exploitative than others. That's not an ex post justification for colonialism, don't get me wrong, but it also means that there is a nuance here. That's one thing. The other thing is that, as I see the world today, it's less about Europe becoming more powerful than it was or whatever. It's just about Europe actually holding its position in the global game to some extent, avoiding becoming irrelevant. And also about, being if it has the strength to do so, being a global custodian for human rights and the rule of law and democracy. But that requires a certain strength, right? We're seeing that now. Europe always talks about nice things, about exporting democracy and the rule of law and women's rights and whatever. All nice to have, but then it doesn't have the means to enforce any of this, right? Instead, it's China. It's an increasingly assertive US, just interested in its own. Maybe it's coming back at one stage to this enlightened self-interest that characterized it for much of its history. But we'll see, right? That's one thing. The other thing is that a lot of the former colonies or of the global South doesn't need us to lecture to them, right? I mean, look at the dynamism of, China, a former, not formally colony, but a country that was definitely considered a quasi-colony by the Western powers for much of its last 150 years of history until definitely after World War I, if not World War II. And a lot of, say, the assertiveness of China nowadays comes from the point of view, we will never be subjugated in the way we were in the 1850s by the British and the French. And we are now making up for the humiliations that we have experienced as a nation there. So that's these countries are becoming very assertive, rightfully so to some extent, right? They have to take their place in the world, but I don't think China needs our help or a nuclear power like India. All right, or an economic superpower with 200 million people like Brazil, right? More than 200. So, yes, you have to be responsible. You have to avoid a new colonialism. That's actually a big question, right? Because some of the former colonial powers, if you think of China being one, actually behaving in a quasi-colonial way in many countries, right? They don't care who governs. They will actually work with any dictator as long as they give them ports, as long as they give them resources, as long as they give them mining rights, then they actually give huge loans to these countries, do a lot of foreign direct investment, build roads and so forth. And if things go bad, I mean, they insist on the debt being paid back. I mean, the one country on the global scene that is currently blocking a restructuring of developing country debt is China, right? The former colonial powers would be much more willing to restructure and forgive a lot of debt of emerging and developing economies. That's something that sometimes tends to be forgotten in this discussion. So I think it's more about, Europe holding its ground. It's not being about an expansionist agenda, but still playing a role in the world and being a moral power. But as we see now, being a moral power also requires having the means to, on the margin, being able to enforce through economic sanctions or slight military pressure and the rule of law and your values of democracy. And Ukraine is a test case for that, right? Are we able to do that? And the Americans, with some justification, say, well, I mean, that's your doorstep, not ours. Your interest is much bigger, so you should pay for this primarily. And that's hard to deny as an argument and refute as an argument. And that's what I think this is about. Should we enable developing countries to grow? Yes. There's a lot of hypocrisy there. We now talk about a lot, say, for example, climate finance to these countries and so forth. I'm not always so sure that these funds will end up in a way that is well used, right? Also because a lot of these countries, and it's not necessarily only the fault of the former colonizers, are very badly governed. So they're corrupt elites and so forth who just channel off funds. So just direct payments to these countries. I don't think that's the way forward. There's a much simpler way that Europe preaches so much about, right? When it comes to, having access to markets in the US, having access to markets in China. China, by the way, nobody has been lambasting China. We have been lambasting China, but it's not getting anywhere the same coverage as, say, what Trump is now doing. China has been closing its market for the last 35 years, right? You can't just go and invest. So there are huge limits on this, and Europe has been making that point, rightfully so, time and again. It's now making the same claim towards the US. We want free trade. We want open markets. But then when it comes to itself, Europe is also fairly protectionist, right? Because it still has a big agrarian sector, and the French and the Poles won't allow easy imports of grain or whatever agricultural commodities into Europe. Often under the pretext, they're genetically modified, or they are that, and that, and that. Well, who would benefit from that? Brazil or Africa, right? So for a lot of these former colonies, Brazil wasn't exactly a colony, at least not recently, but say in Africa, open markets in Europe would be a big step forward. They don't often have them. That's something we can do. I think that's more important in the end than paying a couple of billions for climate accommodation that then end up somewhere in some dictator's coffers. So that's, I think, leave the values to preach. Also towards your former colonies. I think that's the best way. That's also the best way to contain China, because then people will realize, those guys just pursuing their own interests. Europe is also pursuing these interests, but it's doing it in a lightened way, right? Replaced by certain rules. If the Americans don't do it, let's ourselves do it.
I also think now is a really good time for European countries to invest more in development cooperation with these emerging countries, especially now that US aid doesn't exist anymore and China is just going after its own interest. But I feel like there are a lot of investments made in former colonies, but these investments don't seem to be that efficient, or they don't bring that much value. And how could that be improved? How could European countries invest more in these countries so that they can flourish in the long term?
I think market size matters, and I mean, if you look into Africa, then I mean, sometimes think. I mean, I'm not an expert in Africa, but what I see is that it's very hard to even to often to imagine for us from a European or a US perspective how large the barriers are, how high the barriers are, for example, for trade between these countries, infrastructure, regulations, corruption, makes it super hard to utilize this internal market. But then at the same time, you see that Africa is coming, right? You see a startup scene in countries like Nigeria and South Africa and say even Northern Africa. It's like Morocco, Mauritania have tremendous success over the last years. They're not necessarily democratically governed, but say Morocco, for example, is at least politically stable and has resisted the temptations of political Islam, and is one of the prime destinations of European foreign direct investment, right? I mean, car manufacturing and a lot of other industries. So it can happen. I mean, a lot of the homework these countries have to do themselves in order to leverage the internal markets. We will not be able to undo that. We can help. But before you get private investment in these areas, I mean, certain criteria have to be met. And then if they are met, you see it happening, like, say, in politically stable North Africa, say, in particular Morocco and these countries. That's it. Market size is also, of course, outside. So what access do these countries have to our markets? Because that's where the demand is, right? You can have often you see economic development miracles are predicated because a lot of countries, when they start, have these immature domestic markets. They have poor financial markets, they have poor internal regulation and so forth. And of course, you need to try to build these things up. But sometimes it helps to have an export industry that tucks the rest of the economy with it, right? It becomes more efficient, it attracts labor, it needs a regulatory framework to actually work with the rest of the world, and then you get domestic institutional development. A lot of, say, the growth miracles of the last 100 years are like that, right? Because Japan, South Korea, and so forth start exporting, often with government help. They see, okay, to play along the rules, we play the international game, we need a certain domestic infrastructure in legal terms, in institutional terms, in physical terms, roads, and so forth, in regulatory terms, in terms of the development of the financial system, and so forth. So it's not a one-way street. That's something we can do in Europe, right? Are we open to young entrepreneurs from Nigeria? I don't think we are sufficiently open to these. That doesn't mean that we have, that also would help us with the migration crisis, right? Because would keep people in their countries, basically, would allow us to select the best, the ones that work to mutual benefit, educate them, so also send them back when they have chances back home. And I think that's the way to do it. Yes, that's soft power.
Yeah.
But you cannot have soft power while shutting yourself off.
Exactly.
You need to be open.
You mentioned that these countries have to do a lot of their homework themselves, and I'm asking myself is why are so few former colonies solid democracies or really economic powerhouses? Is it just due to the systems colonizers have left behind, or is it more because of what happened afterwards?
I think it's both, right? I mean, I'm not. I don't want to exculpate colonizers for the scars they left, but then there's too much variation across the colonized, and for that to be the only explanatory factor, right? It's also true that a lot of these states came into being, say, with borders drawn by former colonizers, and then they were, for example, ethnically very, very heterogeneous to the extent that you couldn't make it work. And then if you have societies that are primarily tribally organized, where the notion of a nation doesn't exist, right? Why should it exist? It's a pretty European concept origin, right? Then that makes it very, very difficult, and that's very, very hard to solve. That said, I think these things can be overcome, right? If you have a certain institutional framework that you either adopt or sometimes copy from your former colonizers. And there, what I said earlier is, it's really true. There are better and worse colonizers in relative terms. I'm not justifying colonization and colonialism exposed, but it remains a fact that, and that's something that, for example, in say economic history and economic growth, is debated very actively by people like Ron Acemoglu and so forth at MIT and other leading economists. I mean, he's won a Nobel Prize after all for that, where it matters for the institutions the colonizers left behind. I mentioned India, right? I mean, don't want to make the British better than they were in their colonial power, but they usually left behind a legal system that wasn't also only predicated on exploiting the local country. If you look into what the Belgians did in Congo, it wasn't about leaving an institutional footprint. It was just about extracting resources and slave trade, right? Completely exploitative. How do you leave a positive footprint? Devastating, right? So colonial and legal origin is often an explanatory factor. I mean, the Brits were colonizers, but they were already a relatively open society by the time they were colonizers, right? And they transfused that to their colonies to some extent, right? Gandhi was a British trained lawyer, and he could become a British trained lawyer. There are a lot of colonies that were French or Portuguese and so forth where that didn't happen, at least not to the same extent. And that matters a lot. So what's the institutional heritage that your colonizers left? And then, of course, what's the institutional heritage that your own country has, right? I mean, China was never formally a colony, but has 5,000 years history. So even though it felt like a colony because if de facto it was ruled by colonial powers in the late 19th century, it had a history. This giant nation with a common culture to fall back on, from which now, of course, it draws tremendous strength, even though the new emperors are wreck and communist notionally, but I mean, in many ways are in their own cultural tradition quite deeply rooted, right? So there's too much heterogeneity to say this is this or this is this.
Yeah,
I think, all right. And to apportion blame.
yeah, absolutely. I think there is a lot of there are a lot of opportunities for co-development because Europe now faces also the struggle with not so solid democracies and also that the economic development in Europe isn't as great. So collaboration may be a good idea. Okay.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, it's also reason to be upbeat, right? I mean, democracy is, I mean, and sometimes, yes, there's a struggle there, and there are issues. Look at where the US is going, and so forth. Overall, I'm a bit more upbeat about this because, I mean, over the last 30 years in Europe in particular, we have also come to expect that everything gets better all the time. It's get ever more democratic and so forth. And that's historically almost never the case, right? There are cycles. It doesn't mean that you completely fall back into a world of dictatorship and so forth. But there are cycles, and democracy in any political system is about interest struggles, power struggles, quite legitimate. The question is how these struggles are carried out. That also may entail that you waver in your democratic standards for a while, right? Also, what's perceived as democratic has been changing over time. We have also become a more strict in our own assessment what a good democracy is, right? If we measured our own democracies back in the 1980s against these standards, they wouldn't hold up very well, even though that allegedly was the time when they were all intact and the old party system still ruled and so forth. Do we want to go back to the 1980s? I don't think so, right? Even if there's an AfD in German parliament nowadays, yeah, we'll be able to deal with that. There's also a question of, how resilient is a democracy? And I'm a little bit more optimistic than many, I think, on this.
Okay, thank you very much for being part of this conversation.